Bangladesh has suddenly descended into chaos. There were efforts to arrest the situation. Perhaps those efforts were rather ham-handed and backfired. But perhaps there were other forces at play. The army is ostensibly in charge. There is no martial law, but the army is trying to forge a new government, an interim government. The army, even if it is tempted to take over directly, might not be up to the task. The problem for India is going to be that we already have two very active fronts. Now suddenly we see that Myanmar has spiraled out of control and Bangladesh could just as well spiral out of control. There are going to be serious repercussions for India's security. There are already pogroms being carried out against the Hindu community. All across Bangladesh, minorities have been targeted. They have become the new Jews of Bangladesh. Bangladesh has suddenly descended into chaos. The situation in Bangladesh had been deteriorating for a few weeks now. There were efforts to arrest the situation. Perhaps those efforts were rather ham-handed and backfired. But perhaps there were other forces at play which would ensure that the situation could not be addressed despite taking political, administrative and judicial steps to address the demands of the agitators, but it seems it all went out of control. The position of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina had become untenable and she was forced to quit. But having quit, we have seen a situation over the last 48 hours where things have been steadily going downhill. The army is ostensibly in charge. There is no martial law. There is some talk that fresh elections will be held. We'll have to wait and see if indeed that is the case, or whether the army wants to prolong the rule of the interim government, or even if the army wants to step in directly. Now, it is quite possible that as the situation evolves, the army, even if it is tempted to take over directly, might not be up to the task. For two reasons. One, there are going to be international repercussions if the army was to take over control directly. And I think Bangladesh is not in a situation where they can afford sanctions or any other measures that Western governments, which seem to be really obsessed with democracy and in their obsession with democracy seem to be sowing and seem to be promoting destabilization of countries, as indeed we have seen in the case of Bangladesh. So it's not very clear if an army takeover will be even acceptable. But even if it was acceptable, will the army be able to restore order? And I say this because we have seen a lot of the assumptions on the basis of which we have tried to assess evolving situations in the region haven't actually turned out to be true. Now, I'm not saying those assumptions were inherently wrong. In fact, those assumptions have been based on the past historical record. But I think things seem to have changed drastically over the last few years, and many of those old assumptions do not really hold true. So, for example, in 2021, when the Taliban were making an offensive to capture Kabul, there was a lot of speculation at that point of time that the Taliban will not be able to capture Kabul, that Afghanistan will descend into a kind of a civil war, that the Afghan National Army and the Afghan elites will resist the Taliban, and all the estimations were made on that basis. And till as late as July, there were assessments, including of the genius agencies of the West, that the Afghan state, as was then constituted, will be able to hold on at least for 6 months and maybe longer, provided support was given to them. And then we saw within a couple of weeks, everything collapsed like a deck of cards, like a house of cards rather, and the Taliban took over. Our own assumptions in India was that there will be resistance. There was none. We then saw in Myanmar there was a coup against the government, and everybody assumed that, like in the past, another coup has taken place in Myanmar, and the army will stamp its authority, will be able to keep the lid over all the multiple points of friction that were there in the country. They'll be able to manage things, and that is the basis on which we proceeded. And what we have seen is that assumption has fallen flat on the ground. The army is nominally in control, yes, but we've seen virtually an implosion in Myanmar. It's become ungovernable. There are large swaths of territory which are no longer in the control of the military in Myanmar, and this was not something that anybody had really anticipated. So Myanmar, the military wasn't able to hold on. We see in Pakistan again, the military rigged the election. Incidentally, the military has rigged the election, it has brutalized the people, but the Americans, who are so bothered about democracy in Bangladesh and imposed sanctions on an elected government, on civilian politicians in Bangladesh, for what the Americans claim to be the death of democracy in Bangladesh, have not imposed any sanctions on the generals in Pakistan or on Shahbaz Sharif and his party, which had actually lost the election but were planted into power by the military. No sanctions out there. In fact, aid is being given to Pakistan because Americans think that Pakistan is actually fighting terrorism. But even in Pakistan, we see that the way the military was able to stamp its authority and its control, it isn't able to do anymore. And you can see the panic in the military because all their efforts at propaganda have fallen flat. All their efforts to repress the people and silence them are not working. We see in places like Balochistan, in KP, in other parts of Pakistan, large demonstrations against the military, against the kind of system that exists in Pakistan. So the military hasn't really been able to put the lid back on. And there are serious concerns within Pakistan. A lot of people in Pakistan are now talking about whether they might be heading towards another civil war-like situation. So we've seen in Pakistan again, some of our old assumptions have fallen, which is why I raised this question whether our assumptions on Bangladesh that the military will step in, restore order, restore control will hold true. We'll have to wait and see. It could happen, but it just as well could not happen. Now, the problem for India is going to be that we already have two very active fronts. We have one with Pakistan, which has become even more active over the last few weeks since the terrorism tap has been turned on by the Pakistanis once again, and there has been no retaliation from India so far. We've already had a very active front with the Chinese. It's been there for the last 4 years, more than 4 years now. And we have tens of thousands of troops actually in an eyeball to eyeball confrontation out there, although efforts are being made at the diplomatic level to bring down temperatures, to solve some of these issues, but it remains a very tense situation. So those two fronts were already open, and now suddenly we see that Myanmar has spiraled out of control and Bangladesh could just as well spiral out of control. So you have a third active front, or at least a destabilized third front. And then in a country like Bangladesh, which is not a small country, it's 175, 180 million people. If you have a situation of anarchy and chaos, then there are going to be serious repercussions for India's security. Because one, if you have a massive influx of refugees, there are already pogroms being carried out against the Hindu community in Bangladesh. There are very distressing scenes of violence being visited upon them. their shops and their homes being looted, people being butchered on the streets. And of course, I don't go after all those so-called fact checkers who will, plant one picture on another to show that people are trying to protect the religious minorities. That's propaganda. The real thing is what is happening on the ground. And what is happening on the ground is that all across Bangladesh, minorities have been targeted. They have become the new Jews of Bangladesh. What the Jews were in Hitler's Germany is what the Hindus are in Bangladesh today. Actually, even in Pakistan, but since we are talking about Bangladesh, let's stick to Bangladesh. So you have that situation develop out there. And we could see an influx of Hindu refugees once again. But if the chaos and anarchy was to spread in Bangladesh and there was no law and order was not to be restored, then you could just as well see influx of the Muslim Bangladeshis as well into India, trying to run away from an anarchic situation in Bangladesh. So one is of course the refugee question. The second problem for India is going to be that if at all there is some semblance of stability, but you have a new regime in Bangladesh which comprises of rabidly anti-Indian elements like the Bangladesh National Party or the very pernicious Islamist radical party, the Jamaat-e-Islami. If you have people like that come into power, then we could see again a new wave of terrorism from Bangladesh. We saw that in the past, in the first decade of this century. When the BNP was in power with Jamaat-e-Islami, they were sponsoring not just Islamist terror groups in India, but also separatist groups from the northeast were also being given support and sanctuary in Bangladesh. So we could see something like that happen all over again. So that will seriously impact on India's security. And then of course there has been rather over the last 15 years a very beneficial economic relationship that India developed with Bangladesh. Bangladesh was in many ways one of the linchpins of India's look east and act east policy. And if Bangladesh is going into a meltdown, then of course your entire act east policy has serious questions about it. As it is, some of your connectivity projects which would have gone through Myanmar are up in the air, and now with Bangladesh going under, you have problems on that count, but you also have problems in terms of connectivity projects that would have linked the northeast with mainland India. That also are I think they have a question mark around them. And then of course there is that very beneficial, mutually beneficial business and commercial relationship that existed with Bangladesh. So that also is now up in the air. So what you have is that if you have this deadly cocktail coming together, you will then have a level of destabilization visiting India. And that is not something that we can afford at this point in time. So I think it is very important for India to realize that both in the regional context, which is the immediate neighborhood, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, you have Sri Lanka, which is relatively stable, but again undergoing an economic crisis. Nepal always has a bit of a ferment in it, and you have Myanmar and Bangladesh probably melting down. So you have the regional context, and then you go on to a wider regional context. You have contestation with China, perhaps even conflict. You have your entire Middle East, which is such an important and pivotal place for India, and whatever economic plans we have, both from an energy security point of view, the diaspora which is there, in terms of the new connectivity projects, in terms of the old transport links which we have with Europe and then North America, which all go through that region. Suddenly there is a bit of a question mark around that as well. So all in all, if you look at it, the regional and the global security situation is not looking too good for India. I'm not just saying this is not just about India, it's about other countries also which are going to be impacted. But at a time when we were hoping in India that we are now all set to take off, it suddenly seems that our flight might just get stalled or obstructed for some time because of what's happening around us. And I think this is in many ways going to be the biggest challenge for the government in India right now. They will have to take care of ensuring that India is insulated to the extent it is possible from whatever is happening in the region, and that India manages to handle whatever crises are going to visit the Middle East and other parts of the world. We are able to traverse all those minefields safely without being drawn into other people's conflicts. And I think that will be a very critical challenge for us. Some of what we are seeing in the region is partly power play by the big global powers. Now we might rather prematurely start proclaiming ourselves to be a global power, which we are not. Yes, I could live with somebody describing India as an emerging power, but it is certainly not a global power, certainly not a great power yet, and we have a long way to go before we reach there. And I think there is an effort to queer the pitch for us. Because what happened in Bangladesh, the way some of the Western countries have actively tried to destabilize the Sheikh Hasina government. I'm not saying that the Sheikh Hasina government was blameless. I'm not saying that it was a very virtuous government. But if you look at what your principal contradiction of the times was, it wasn't such a bad government in many ways. It kept some of the Islamists at bay, it kept anti-India elements under control, it ensured a level of prosperity and stability in Bangladesh. So it had many positives, it had many negatives as well. I'm certainly not defending that. But to single them out and impose sanctions on them and then set in play all your dirty tricks department to destabilize that government, to give the impression that it's a kind of a pariah government, I think that was a deliberate move. And it was not just aimed at Bangladesh, perhaps it was also aimed at India. Secondly, there were very serious allegations that the ousted Bangladesh Prime Minister had made against the Americans, for example, making allegations that they wanted some air base and that they were trying to carve out a new country of sorts in the region, a Christian-dominated country as per Sheikh Hasina. I don't know how true or whether they completely bunkum all these allegations, but if you look at what has happened over the last few days, I think there would probably be some kernel of truth in the kind of allegations she was making. So there are those concerns as well that the Western countries have in many ways been uniformly hostile towards the current dispensation in India, and there have been efforts to interfere in our elections, to meddle in our politics, to use the NGO and other networks to create narratives and discourses in India which are not exactly in India's favor. All of that has been happening. So I think the big challenge for the government today would be, how do you protect India from all these meddlesome characters? How do you protect India from the interference and the influence operations of some of these great powers, which probably want to pull you in their direction and pull you into wars that you do not want to get pulled into? And if we can avoid that and we can manage the diplomacy around all those issues, then I think a lot of the economic ambitions that this government has, trying to raise India's GDP to 5, maybe $10 trillion towards 2030, maybe 2035, make India into, bring India into the level of a developed country, at least a middle income country by 2047. All of those dreams can be fulfilled. But if we start getting dragged into other people's wars, if we start doing stuff which destabilizes our own country, then I think we'll have serious problems on our hand, and I think we should be wary of that. And finally, I think it is just as important that the government, not just at the center but even in the states, realize that anything which is done to disturb social harmony. I'm not saying that means that you let everybody run amok, certainly not. If anybody steps out of line, the government must crack down and crack down hard. That does not mean that the government should not take decisions which might not be entirely palatable to one section of society or a bunch of people. That's not my suggestion. But I think we need to tone it down. We need to ensure that the social harmony in India is not disturbed, because that is again something that a serious effort will be made to be done in India to disturb that. So in a sense, you have three active fronts. You have a front domestically which could open up, which you need to keep closed, and you could have another front open up internationally, not in your control, but you still have to live in that reality of a Middle East, a wider war in the Middle East, or other theaters opening up, perhaps China, Taiwan, we don't know. But I think we are living in a very unsafe world right now, and the basic thing that the government needs to do is to protect and defend India from what is happening, the storms that are raging around us. How do we insulate ourselves from those storms and protect ourselves from them?